Hey, and good morning. Welcome. We are here at Organic Intelligence and happy to share some time with you today. I'm doing these musings, and have been these Sundays spending a little time in musings and sharing some with my friendly geekdom, some information about organic intelligence in particular. And if you're just tuning in, I'd say welcome. If you're not familiar with this process of organic intelligence yet, I'm Steve Hoskinson, founder of Organic Intelligence, and I want to share a little bit about what's useful and what can be practical and helpful in understanding the way our biology works. And that's been a long fascination with me, is just how things work. And if you, like me, are a Homo sapien, then you share in the club of life. And interesting these days how we are all in the same big boat, as it were. And this boat is not characterized by fear of viruses. It's characterized by love of life, and that's what we are. We have this basic sort of human tribal existence, and the love of life is what characterizes us. And here I'm quoting this preeminent psychophysiologist by the name of E.O. Wilson, who had coined this term called biophilia. And biophilia is this love of life. It's what characterizes us. The experience of that, however, is this experience that is grown within us. That is, we arose in the midst of our tribal configuration. We are a uniquely social species, and so as a uniquely social species, we have evolved somehow, and we have evolved, and in a way, we took a turn some time ago, and that turn was this turn called the domestication of plants and animals. And with the domestication of plants and animals, we stopped living in our unique tribal configurations. And when we left that's been quite some time. And I describe this sometimes as being our Nemo moment. We are now in a Nemo moment, and this Nemo moment is we're in the aquarium, but we have a sense like we belong someplace bigger. We belong somehow to the ocean. We belong somehow to the great body of living beings. And that Nemo moment has us with a unique and important experience. It's longing. And that longing and the experience of longing is this compass for us. And I'll talk about that much more as I begin to speak about the way we work with human beings and the way we understand what really guides us. What's the guiding light that resets our compass? Because when we walked out of the late Pleistocene, when we walked out of our tribal situation 15,000 years ago, that was the last time we saw home. That was the last time we saw normal, was 15,000 years ago. That's been a while. And so everything now looks really usual. And I call it this age of disintegration, where our connections one to another are more characterized by disconnection than connection. And so we are learning in organic intelligence what the nature of our biology is that grows us back together. What is it that gets us back together and brings us home, that sets our compass? We are wandering in the wilderness now. We are functionally a tribe of people looking for our tribe, and we are wandering in the wilderness. And how are we going to find our way back to where we belong? And so it will be through help of those of us that have studied for this for a long time and have gotten together and helped one another to find our way, and in particular to value ancient traditions and understand ancient traditions enough that call for this compass return. And so, you hear this in Rumi. He said, what is it? The sun coming up brings clear wine air. Being sober isn't living. Listen to the longing of the stringless harp and stand watch over that burning. listen to the longing, right? And what we are figuring out here in organic intelligence and figuring out how our biology works is how we can have enough support in the absence of our primordial support of our tribe. How can we have enough support to be able to tolerate our diaspora, our wandering in the wilderness? How are we going to be able to tolerate the discomfort of that? How are we going to provide enough soothing and enough support in order to be able to find our way back, to come back together and find our way back? And so for years, I've studied this and looked at this and finding good news that in our own biology, in your biology, is a wisdom, is a self-organizing principle. And this is science now. I was fortunate in the early 90s to meet and consult with Ernest Rossi. And Ernest Rossi is a Jungian. Ernest Rossi is the author also of the collected works of Milton Erickson, and really has looked forward into the science, and at that time pointed me toward complexity science chaos theory. And so since the early 90s, I was fortunate then to have this encounter where we learned about the way your biology can be self-organizing and what it takes in order to be self-organizing. And so it was really then this understanding of self-organizing systems that we're exploring in organic intelligence. And over the period of 20 years, began to develop this clinical approach that was based first, of course, in clinical psychology, based furthermore on the work in the contemplative arts and meditation and the exploration of a spiritual quest, and then further into the work around the way that the biology is functioning and the way to integrate all of the channels of experience. And now, really, we are understanding that it is going to be all of these channels. And so I've created this map for us called the Eye Soma Map. And the Eye Soma Map tells us that it is all of these channels of experience that I have to become an expert in order to help people and to help myself. I learn about each of these channels. The Eye Soma is an acronym that stands for image, sensation, orientation, meaning, and affect. And so, as you know, many traditions will focus on one or the other of these. And what is unique here in organic intelligence is that we are looking at the interaction among all of these. That is, we are understanding ourselves as a system within systems. That is, these interactions in my physiology, image, sensation, orientation, meaning, and affect, this is the contents that creates my consciousness. And my consciousness then is further influenced and contextualized also within other consciousnesses. And we are interpersonal, and we create systems and subsystems among ourselves. So in our family, in our collective communities, in our a larger sense of a species identification, and then into even larger realms of the more cosmic consciousness, you could say, and their relationship with ancestors and so on. That is, my sense of being home is a home not only within my individual self, but within each nested layer from the biology on up to the cosmos. And when I am home in each of those, and I find my connection in each of those, then I am embedded really fully within the systems that are more like our home, more tribal, more sense of we are in the same big boat. And whatever you think about the coronavirus, and however you are creating, a sense of what's now known as social distancing, which we heard yesterday also being called responsible, solidarity, right? Like distant, sort of virtual solidarity, which we're having right here, right now, right? That this togetherness has so much more opportunity than my individual quest. And it is always these two sides. Always these two sides. And so these two sides harken back to the basics of the spiritual and traditions, ancient traditions that say, for instance, Gurdjieff in seeking wisdom in various traditions like the Sufi tradition and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and others would say there is this law of three. There's this law of three that says there is both sides. Every stick has two ends, and then there is a neutral observer. In other words, there are three sides, and one of those three sides is this neutral. And then there are going to be this positive and negative sides. In other words, every stick has two ends, and when we hold one end versus holding both, then we have a real issue that is problematic. So whenever we hold to only one view of ourselves or our existence, we are necessarily limited. So in this time, in the musings time, we are going to look at some of the basic ideas of how systems work, and I look at some of the things that I'm interested in. It's musings, it's geeky science, and I'm gonna lay some interesting ideas on you, I hope. Beginning with our morning cuppa. This notion of everything has two sides is the basis of our fundamental psychology and our physiology. We are filled with oscillators, these two sides, and these two sides are as simple as the firing of a nerve cell, but there are also networks. That is, there are networks of oscillators like the human pacemaker. The human pacemaker doing this on and off and on and off. And the amazing thing, and the reason we are a biology, is that these oscillators learn to tick together. Right? And the movement of this ticking works together, and there is this oscillation. And there's very interesting mathematics that's involved with that. I would look forward to the time to delve into the calculus aspects of this. But in the meantime, we have a clinical approach. We have a wisdom approach that says, let us hold to both sides always. And we have a problem in the balance of things. This is yin and yang, if nothing else, right? This is as old as Taoist perspectives and older. And so the yin and yang of this is that our system is doing this swinging, always these two sides, and we have a problem. And it's called the negativity bias, or in organic intelligence, we call it the what's wrong attention. And the what's wrong attention skews my biology into a direction that would have me walking further away from home. Walking further away from home. Our home is actually going to be found in the balance of these two sides, and the two sides are everywhere. So I just give them colors to make it easy, red and blue. And so we are saying that our attention is drawn toward what's wrong and self-reinforces. But our system wants not to be just stable, which it does. The biology wants to be stable. It also wants to grow. And if we create and understand the necessity of stability and the necessity of the system to do that self-support, then we can begin to grow better, grow faster, and grow more meaningfully in the way that our biology wants to. In other words, we cooperate with the way our system wants to work. So, although I've created this rather complex system of understanding the biology and the relationship between fight and flight and freeze, the fight and this is fight and flight. This is freeze. These are commonly known now in the trauma world, and where I've taught for many years. And as well, what you see is it's all comprised of pairs, red and blue pairs. And these red and blue pairs are simply the cycles of oscillation. And there are dimensions of that oscillation that are really key. And so these dimensions of oscillation include elements of consciousness, elements of image, sensation, orientation, meaning, and affect that have this quality of self-organization. In other words, most of your image, sensation, meaning, and affect, most of your internal experience in any given moment is going to be sending signals of stability. That's the first rule of the biology. Don't die. The second rule then is to create this flow and expansion of capacity. So, in order to grow, then we have to do a couple of things. We have to respect the need for that stability to maintain, and it is often thought like, oh, I need to be more positive. I need to think more positive. I have to be more blue if you're using OI language, but it's not. It's really not, and it is counterintuitive. But the first thing that we look for, and the first sort of rule of our work, and the first task is actually this initial condition right here, and it's orientation. Orientation. And orientation as connecting to the environment through the senses. And I developed this over many years. I was teaching in SE and really began to say, no, it's not the somatic part. It's not the sensation element that is most key. It's actually the orientation and the oscillation of orientation. So in the end of trauma course, we really practice, in particular, we get that personal practice really residing in the self-organizing principle of the biology, not by paying attention to the internal experience. I'm trained as a therapist. I trained in clinical psychology, and we then we're paying attention to various things like the imaginal. We'd use imaginal work in hypnosis, for instance, or in meditation. The image channel is important, or we would use affect. Right, we're going to look as a therapist at the affects, at the feelings, the emotional experience. And the classic therapist, caricature is, how do you feel about that? Or we'd look at the cognitive areas, and we'd look at cognition, the nature of cognition as in the meaning channel. And then later we began to work more in the area of sensation, as we found in the Olney school. The Dick Olney school was really creating this systems framework for understanding the use of sensation, including with the tradition of Gurdjieff and others. And bioenergetics was another part of that the Olney school. And so they were looking at discharge in particular and how important discharge was. But for us, and what I began to discover was it's not so much that internal experience that's key, but the balance with the external. And so began to really bring home and created a framework in which orientation became connecting to the external world through the senses, connecting to the environment through the senses. So it's not so much about paying attention to sensation or image or feelings or cognitions. All of that matters, but in a unique oscillatory framework. That is, there is a way that the biology will organize based in this understanding of oscillation of attention between the external world and the internal world, and that balance of attention rides on a quality of experience that has ease about it. That is, there is that which I do. There are all of these things which I do to help set up the conditions for biological organization. But we cannot do biological organization. We can't do biological synchrony. We can only create the conditions for this to happen. So our work here is indeed work. And it is this work to create a self-organizing environment. And we have a biologically derived pathway for that. And it is what feels good. And it's what feels good. It's like, how do the bees find the flowers? There is a sense like, this is the right way to go, right? And for us, that is called the approach avoidance system. And the approach is guided by the experience of longing, but also of pleasure. And so as we go forward, we have a very specific protocol, if you will, that is called orientation to pleasure. So we create this oscillation between this orientation is connecting to the exterior and then interior, exterior, interior. There's a kind of oscillation of that. And there is an equal oscillation of effort and non-effort, paying attention, relaxing attention. And in the meantime, we are aiming to find this notion of ease. And ease is, and the sense of flow is this compass also of pleasure. And so we say we do orientation and we do orientation to pleasure, so much so, right? That pleasure also because that's the pathway that we grow in. We grow our species, we grow our mating, we grow our bonding, we grow our connections. The job is enjoyment. And that's because that's how nature designed us. Again, the preeminent psychophysiologist, a Pulitzer Prize winning author, E.O. Wilson, looked at our species and said, we're made for pleasure. Look at these receptors. Look at how we orient, and it's pleasure. And so we say the job is enjoyment. And the job is enjoyment, but in part also because of the quality of enjoyment that goes with ease and non-effort. I was interviewed for a book called Effortless Mindfulness, and there is this ease that is associated with this process, and it is including orientation as connecting to the exterior environment through the senses, the exterior environment. So I'm coming out of the awareness of internal experience, and it's completely opposite of what mindfulness has said before, as it's translated here, and it is the opposite of what therapy has said. And so it is a little counterintuitive. And so what you've been hearing here in these musings is some of the science behind this. And so today, the scientific geeky wisdom here at 22 minutes and 22 seconds in is another article that I want to share, another current article in Science. And why do I do these? Because I want to make available to you the current science with ease. So here's what we're looking at today. And the reason, again, why I'm doing this on YouTube instead of asking you to read this thing, the article is called Temporal Circuit of Macro-Scale Dynamic Brain Activity Supports Human Consciousness. Yep, you heard it here first. Temporal Circuit of Macro-Scale Dynamic Brain Activity Supports Human Consciousness. That's by Wang Zhang Wu, Mashur, and Hudetz. That's right. So these authors, really quite brilliantly, are pointing us again toward the areas of network brain cognition. We have exited the notion of brains as being localized. Memory is not localized in a specific area. Remember back in the day, they'd put an electrode into a particular part of the brain and the person would go, oh, I just remember grandma's bread baking. And they're like, there is grandma's cell there. And there is the cell for bread baking memory and so on. It's not like that. We are a network and we are a constellation, right? That is, there are constellations of our Eye Soma experiences that create these states. And these states themselves are in oscillation. And the important oscillation that is a part of organic intelligence is the first oscillation that we learn in the end of trauma course, which is to get the attention out before we bring the attention in. And that's why this musing is called outside in, because the first most important step for helping create the conditions for our organized biology is this orientation. Right, is this orientation. And the things that I do first is I work toward that orientation so that then the brain remembers, oh yeah, that's what I do. I map the environment. Mapping the environment is one of the most important aspects of our biology and is a function of consciousness. So this article then, it says it compares two specific brain networks, and this is again a network perspective, a systems perspective, and there is these two networks, and so the temporal circuit is what they're calling about, and the macro scale dynamic brain activity. Macro scale brain dynamic brain activity is a system. Macro is a big thing. It's this bigger picture, and there are brain networks, and they looked at two brain networks, one of which you've heard me talk about quite a bit here, and it's called the default mode network. The default mode network is one of the two networks that they're talking about, and the other is the dorsal attention network. So there's default mode and the dorsal attention network. These are the two states. These are the two dynamic brain activities that they're talking about, and they are linked. And this is what this article is saying. They're saying there is a link between those two, and what they're saying is that consciousness is residing in the oscillation between these two. Oscillation between these two. So there is the default mode network, and then there's the dorsal attention network. Now, let me describe what those are just briefly. I've talked a good bit about the default mode network. The default mode network, let me just say what this is. First of all, the dorsal attention network is an externally directed system that correlates with consciousness of the environment. The dorsal attention network is an externally directed system that correlates with consciousness of environment, orientation, right? Consciousness of the environment. The default mode network engages in a variety of internally directed processes that are happening automatically, like autobiographical memory, imagination, and so on. And like daydreaming, it's not goal directed. In other words, it is something that's happening. It's not something that I do. It is something that is happening. So here we have this basic framework, and what for the dorsal attention network, it mediates what's called externally directed cognitive processes. Externally directed cognitive processes. Such as that includes goal-driven attention, inhibition, and top-down guided voluntary control. So this is a 2020 article, and it's saying that there needs to be this oscillation between these two networks, the default mode and the dorsal attention network. Look at what we have here in phase 2. Phase 2 includes inhibition, doing or agency, goal-directed, focused behavior, right? That is inhibitory, right? That is this doing. This is agency, top-down, guided, voluntary control, inhibition, goal-driven attention. That's phase 2. Phase 3 is then more related to a dominance of the default mode and the availability always of this oscillation between phase 2 and phase 3 is the hallmark of organic intelligence and our organic intelligence clinical protocol. If you want to learn this for yourself and experience for yourself, the End of Trauma course is the way to go, and that will lead to also a possibility of engaging in our Heart at Home, the coaching certificate, where you can learn to do this. So the clinical protocol I've been developing over 20 years. I've taught it to trauma therapists worldwide. We're at organicintelligence.org, and I'm going to be musing more with you, and hopefully not only musing, but a little bit amusing in the face of hard science, like temporal circuit of macroscale dynamic brain activity that supports human consciousness. If you're interested in human consciousness, be interested in joining us here in Organic Intelligence. We have all online courses. And so in this day and age, our online courses are those that are supporting human consciousness and the experience of wellness and goodness. One other favor, like our channel, create some comments. Thank you for joining me in this morning's musings, and there will be more coming next Sunday. Yep. Have a great day, and I'll look forward to being in touch. Organic Intelligence, I'm Steve Hoskinson.